Welcome back to Knowledge on the Go, Wit and Wisdom Virtual Lessons. My name is Mrs. Lopez, and I'll be one of your teachers for this virtual lesson experience. Pause and take a minute to remind yourself of our expectations. Be ready to think, share your ideas, look forward to learning, and try to stay focused. As you might recall, in the last lesson, we noticed and wondered about Nelson Mandela in the South Africa's 1995 Rugby World Cup victory. Today, I'm excited to continue learning with part 2 of lesson 1 of grade 5, module 4, Breaking Barriers. For this lesson, you will need a pencil and your journal. Pause the video now if you need to get any materials or need a minute to get organized for learning. As you may recall, we have a big question for our essential question. How can sports influence individuals and societies? Over several lessons, we will answer the question, how can sports affect the way we view others? Today, we will answer the question, what is the essential meaning of the documentary about Nelson Mandela in South Africa's 1995 Rugby World Cup victory? We will be watching the documentary again, this time in 2 parts. We want you to listen and watch to gain a deeper understanding of the story the filmmakers are telling about Nelson Mandela in South Africa's 1995 Rugby World Cup victory. I want to remind you this film takes place in 1994 when South Africa had just become a democracy and Nelson Mandela had just been elected president. The country was going through their efforts to give Black and white South Africans equal rights. During the documentary, there are 3 questions I want you to focus in the first part. Why was the country of South Africa so divided when Nelson Mandela became president in 1994? Why did Nelson Mandela want to bring the 1995 Rugby World Cup to South Africa? And 3, what did the sport of rugby represent to Black South Africans in the early 1990s? How did this affect Black South Africans' attitude toward the Springboks? I want you to take a moment and answer these questions in your journal if you can at this time. If not, you may be able to answer these questions after you watch the video. Pause the video and number your journal 1, 2, and 3 so that you can answer as you watch the video. I encourage you to jot down those answers as we watch the video. Again, don't forget to hit pause to answer any of these questions. Now, let's watch the first part of the video.
Now we will watch a short documentary clip filmed by Scott Duncan about Nelson Mandela. This documentary was featured at the 2009 ESPN ESPY Awards. At this award ceremony, Mandela won the Arthur Ashe Award for Courage for his work to unite his country through sports.
As the violence intensified, Mandela rallied international support to bring the 1995 Rugby World Cup to South Africa, determined to use the world stage to unite his nation. But he was taking a risk because rugby and the South African national team, the Springboks, had long been associated with the very worst of the country's history.
In South Africa, rugby was the white man's game.
I hated rugby, I hated those ones who were playing rugby, and I hated the Springboks even more.
Rugby is a sport of brute force, And as such, rugby in many ways symbolised apartheid oppression with which black people were being kept down.
But now the man called Madiba by his followers was set on making peace with his former oppressors. He would become a rugby fan, but convincing black South Africans to stand behind the long-hated Springboks would not be easy.
You see this cup that I'm wearing? I ask you all to stand behind them because they are our pride.
Here is the man wanting us to reconcile with these brutish people who have humiliated us for ages in our own country. I wasn't going to be persuaded even by the great Madiba to support the Springboks.
As the World Cup approached, Mandela repeated his message of one team, one country in townships and villages across South Africa. Moved by Mandela's support, the Springbok players visited the Robben Island prison, where Mandela had been jailed for nearly 3 decades.
Now that you've finished the recording of the first part, reread the questions, and you can pause the video to answer them in your journal. First question, why was the country of South Africa so divided when Nelson Mandela became president in 1994? One possible answer is some white people were ready to go to war against the blacks. Or the country suffered from apartheid. Blacks and whites were not considered equals. Not every answer will be exactly the same, but something within this area. Question number 2. Why did Nelson Mandela want to bring the 1995 Rugby World Cup to South Africa? There was lots of violence between black and white South Africans when Mandela became president. He thought it could help everyone in the country to support their team, the Springboks. Or he used the phrase, one team, one country, before the World Cup came to South Africa. Question number 3. What did the sport of rugby represent to black South Africans in the early 1990s? How did this affect black South Africans' attitudes towards the Springboks? To many South Africans, the sport of rugby represented apartheid. Because of this, many of them did not support the Springboks. Black South Africans hated rugby and the Springboks. Those are some of the possible answers for these 3 questions. Now we're going to continue with the second part of our documentary. Here are the questions we want to look at when we continue with the second part. Review question number 4, 5, and 6 and see if you are able to answer them before we watch the second part. Again, on your paper, write number 4, 5, 6, and you may pause the videos to answer them now if you can. Now that you've viewed the questions, let's watch the second half of the video. Remember, you can press pause to jot down any ideas, or press pause once the video is done. We will show the questions again to answer. Let's continue with our documentary.
Where Mandela had been jailed for nearly 3 decades.
Go to the cell and you realize he sat here for how many years. I remember James Small standing in the corner and there were tears running down his cheeks.
It was quite amazing to experience just for a few moments what a man experienced for a lifetime. You didn't really understand how big this whole thing was until we saw that.
That also made us realize that what we were doing was a little bit more than just playing a game.
That's the end of the game. Well, who would have believed that South Africa would beat Australia, world champions?
The underdog Springboks, newly inspired, began a magical run through the tournament.
And that's it. South Africa have beaten France in this World Cup semi-final.
But as the team advanced, something even more improbable happened. Black South Africans started to stand behind the national team.
We started realizing that, you know what, this is our country, this is our brothers, we all have to be behind them.
People understood that we're a fledgling democracy, we're on show together. Please show the world that we're doing all right.
One team, one country. That was Mandela's vision. And on the morning of the final game, blacks and whites alike were swept up into a shared frenzy of excitement. As Mandela drove to Ellis Park Stadium, he saw firsthand what just weeks ago had been unimaginable.
We had a lot of white people driving past us, hooting and fists out of the... And normally you'd have the fists out of anger, but these was fists of jubilation.
On all the lights, on all the freeways, you had these enormous flags. Everywhere was just the World Cup, the World Cup.
Beneath the stadium, the Springboks prepared, knowing they would never play a more important game. Moments before they took the field, the silent tension in the locker room was broken.
The door opened, and in walked Nelson Mandela. Nobody knew they was coming to visit us.
He walks in, and he's beaming.
Here's the number one citizen of our country, a black man, wearing a Springbok jersey.
Never in our wildest dreams did we ever expect him to wear a Springbok on his heart.
It was a very, very strong motivator in terms of where we were going and what we had to achieve.
We now down to the big game, and the two great rivals of New Zealand and South Africa out in the middle at Ellis Park.
Tied 12-12 after regulation, the match remains one of the epic finals in rugby history. As play headed to overtime, Mandela sat in the president's box, his great experiment hanging in the balance.
One of the best days, Stransky looks for the drop. Has he got it? Yes, it's over. That is it. The final whistle then. South Africa win this Rugby World Cup final. And what a dramatic finish for the host country.
I don't think I've ever seen so many grown men on the rugby field cry.
After the win, Nelson Mandela, wearing the symbol of his former enemies, prepared to step onto the field.
The crowd just went wild.
It was like a volcano erupting.
I'm trying to understand what the chant is. And I realized that these white South African people were chanting their president's name.
This is Nelson.
Nelson, Nelson. Nelson, Nelson. Nelson, Nelson. That was one voice.
I never thought that we would hear that at a rugby stadium. At the time, I think it was just fantastic.
We didn't know what hit us. I mean, it was just the most phenomenal. It was really quite incredible.
The image of a joyous Mandela celebrating with the national team was mirrored in every corner of the once broken country. South Africans at last were rejoicing as one.
Then we had 65,000 South Africans here today. Tremendous support.
David, we didn't have 60,000 South Africans. We had 43 million South Africans.
It was freedom all over. The moment that the cup was handed over to Madiba, I told myself, these are people that I have to build this country together. There's one South African. All my hatred is going to gain me absolutely nothing.
Madiba took my hand and he shook it and he said, "Thank you very much for what you've done for South Africa." I said, "Madiba, you got it wrong. Thank you for what you've done for South Africa."
I think it was great vision from the man to have used that opportunity to make us see each other as human beings. This is our South Africa.
Now that you've completed watching the documentary second half, let's answer our questions. How and why did the support for the Springboks change as the World Cup tournament progressed? If you haven't answered the question yet, feel free to press pause and answer the questions. As the World Cup tournament progressed, black and white South Africans began to support the Springboks. Also, black and South Africans began to realize this was their country and their team. They wanted to support them at the World Cup. These are just some of the examples of how to answer this question. Nelson Mandela wore the Springboks jersey, showing his support of the team. This caused other people to want to support them too. Question number 5. What is the significance of Nelson Mandela's vision, one team, one country? You can also share your answers with someone if you're working with them. Some of your answers may include blacks and whites together. We're very excited about the final championship game. People were shouting and celebrating together instead of shouting at one another. People began to realize there is only one South Africa, hating it, and the people in it wasn't going to accomplish anything. And lastly, question number 6. Why was the Springboks victory such a momentous event for Nelson Mandela and the people of South Africa? Your answers may include, when they won, the entire country celebrated as one. The players thanked Nelson Mandela for what he had done to bring the country together. The win helped the people of South Africa to see one another as human beings, regardless of their skin color. Now that you've gotten some deeper understanding of Nelson Mandela and the Springboks victory, let's explain how this documentary has helped you gain knowledge. In your journal, and finish these sentences. The first time I watched the documentary, I did not understand blank. After watching it, I now understand. This is a great way to explain how your understanding has developed. And then share a response with somebody you're working with or a family member to let them know what knowledge you've gained about today's documentary. Feel free to pause the video while you finish your responses. Lastly, let's reflect on South Africa's victory. What does South Africa's victory of the 1995 Rugby World Cup represent for Nelson Mandela and the people of South Africa? Use 2 to 3 sentences to explain this. Pause the video to complete your sentences. Your response could include that victory represents a huge step towards peace and unity among all the people in South Africa. The country, which was once divided by apartheid and racism, came together as one to support a team, their team. This concludes today's lesson. In the next lesson, we will read a short story to explore the power of sports and how sports can affect people's views of others. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to info@greatminds.org. And remember, every child is capable of greatness. We had a great lesson today. Have a great day.